The Center for Middle East Studies is honored to be one of 4 co-sponsors of this event. The other 3 being the Josef Korbel School of International Studies, the University of Denver's Center on Rights Development, and the C. Chao Kang Center for International Security and Diplomacy. DU's Center for Middle East Studies is an interdisciplinary institution dedicated to the study of Middle Eastern politics, history, and culture. We seek to engage the University of Denver community and the broader public in informed discussion on topics of regional importance in an effort to deepen understanding of this critical and dramatically changing region of the world. This is the first academic year that the Center for Middle East Studies has been in existence. I see several faces who were at the launch ceremony that we had in February. You can find the center online at du.edu/Korbel/Middle East. You can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/DU Center for Middle East Studies. And you can get on our email list to find out about our upcoming events and programs by simply signing up on one of the sheets at the back table in the back of this room. Just put your email address on that list and we will put you on the list to receive information. I should say, so there are 2 panels today. In a moment I'll introduce the first panel. There's a second panel that I hope all of you will be able to attend at 5:30. It'll go from 5:30 to 7:30 right here in this room. And it will feature General George Casey, 36th Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. General Charles Jacoby, Commander of the North American Aerospace Defense Command and United States Northern Command. Lieutenant General Dana Chipman, U.S. Army Judge Advocate General. Colonel David Grosso, Fort Carson Garrison Commander, and Lieutenant Colonel Michael Wright, Josef Korbel School Army Fellow. That discussion will be moderated by Claude Destray, the director of the International Human Rights Degree Program at the Josef Korbel School. Again, that's at 5:30, right here in this room. As all of you are aware, the last few weeks have seen a deluge of retrospectives marking the 10th anniversary of the launch of the Iraq War. On cable news, in print, online, everywhere you turn. And that's a good thing. But there's something striking about this exercise. Mark Lynch of George Washington University, a leading commentator on the Middle East and U.S. foreign policy, recently observed, quote, "Here's one surprising detail about the flood of Iraq War retrospectives. They've almost exclusively been written by Americans, talking about Americans, for Americans." And he did a count. The New Republic got 8 writers to comment on the anniversary, none Iraqi. Foreign Affairs put out a very good retrospective of its own coverage of Iraq, with 11 articles and 25 contributors, none Iraqi. The New York Times managed to find 1 Iraqi out of a roundtable of 6 contributors. Foreign Policy magazine invited 20 significant participants in the war to talk about its lessons, and didn't include a single Iraqi. The best-selling books about Iraq also tend to focus on American military strategy, Washington policy debates, or General David Petraeus, with only token appearances by Iraqis. This America-centric bias ensnares academics as well as policymakers. And this myopia has consequences, Lynch argues. It isn't just ethically problematic, but strategically problematic, because failing to listen to those Iraqi voices meant getting important things badly wrong. On this panel today, we're going to listen to one of those Iraqi voices, Thabit Abdullah. Professor Abdullah was born and raised in Iraq and came to the United States in 1979, significantly, the year that Saddam Hussein assumed power. He received his PhD in history from Georgetown University in 1992 and went on to serve as director of the Middle East Studies program at the American University in Cairo. from 1992 to 1996. He is currently Associate Professor in the Department of History at York University in Toronto. His teaching and research focus primarily on modern and medieval Iraq, the Indian Ocean, and the Ottoman Empire. He is the author of 3 books. This title I love particularly: Merchants, Mamluks, and Murder: The Political Economy of Commerce in 18th Century Basra. That was published in 2001. A Short History of Iraq, emphasis on short, subtitled From 636 to the Present, published in 2003, interestingly enough. And another book with a great title, Dictatorship, Imperialism, and Chaos, Iraq Since 1989. That book was published in 2006. Professor Abdullah is also a co-editor of the Festschrift Arab and Islamic Studies in honor of Marsden Jones. He is currently working on 2 studies, The Medieval Foundations of the Iraqi State and Slavery and the Slave Trade in 16th Century Syria and Iraq. He is a regular commentator on Iraqi and Arab affairs for a number of Canadian television stations and an occasional guest on the PBS NewsHour. The Center for Middle East Studies is proud to welcome Professor Abdullah to Denver, and we are eager to hear his perspective. His interlocutor will be someone who needs no introduction on this campus, but because this is going to be on YouTube, I have to introduce my colleague and Dean, Christopher Hill, who, as most of you know, served as the United States Ambassador to Iraq from April 2009 until August of 2010, and has been Dean here at the University of Denver's Josef Korbel School of International Studies since September of 2010. He is a career member of the Foreign Service, whose prior assignment was Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. He also served as Ambassador to the Republic of Korea and was head of the U.S. delegation to the 6-party talks on the North Korean nuclear issue, for which he has been rewarded with an unrelenting barrage of media requests in the last few weeks. In fact, he's speaking in Chicago next week, and the event sold out as quickly as a rock concert. Dean Hill previously served as U.S. Ambassador to Poland from 2000 to 2004, and as Ambassador to the Republic of Macedonia from 1996 to 1999, and Special Envoy to Kosovo from 1998 to 1999. He also served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Southeast European Affairs in the National Security Council. Ambassador Hill received the State Department's Distinguished Service Award for his contributions as a member of the U.S. negotiating team in the Bosnia peace settlement, and was a recipient of the Robert S. Frazier Award for Peace Negotiations for his work on the Kosovo crisis. So, just a word about the format for this discussion. We're going to hear from each of these distinguished speakers for approximately 10 to 15 minutes, beginning with Professor Abdullah. After that, I will moderate an exchange, and I might have a couple of questions of my own that I'll pose to our panelists. And after that, we will open the discussion to Q&A with the audience. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Thabit Abdullah to the University of Denver.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the very kind reception. I was told that this was going to be a rather off-the-cuff, informal discussion, and Nader asked me to speak on the past 10 years, of course, and I warned him that I'm a medievalist. So I hope you'll bear with me if I start my discussion in 8th century Baghdad. Those were good times in 8th century Baghdad. Baghdad was probably, it was just being formed, and it would soon become possibly the largest city in the world. One of the amazing things about it, though, even at that early period, was that it was bubbling with intellectual activity. Numerous scholars and organized themselves in various groups, one of which was called the Ikhwan al-Safa, or Brethren of Sincerity. And they wrote about all kinds of things. They commented about theology, about philosophy, sociology, very interesting observations. And they also made recommendations to rulers. One of their recommendations was to make sure that the country would never have a scholar as its ruler. Scholars make for very bad politicians, they warned, because scholars focus too much on the complexity of the issue. They focus too much on the gray areas. They talk about contradictions, and they can never make up their minds of what is right and what's wrong. Whereas a ruler needs to be decisive. He needs to make a choice. So in this regard, they said that while academics or scholars make for bad rulers, it's very important for rulers to listen to them as well. Pay attention to all the complexities before coming up with a firm decision on where to go. I say this because the way that modern Iraq, and especially the past 10 years of terrible, chaotic activity in Iraq, the way that it has been viewed is oftentimes in a rather simplistic fashion, not paying enough attention to the complexities and contradiction of society. Thus we hear an encapsulated argument that doesn't take more than 10 seconds actually to recite here. The first time I heard it was actually by the then Senator Joe Biden in, I think it was late 1980s or early 1990s, I don't remember. But he said, everybody knows why there's a big problem in Iraq. Everybody knows. The secret is that there are three distinct communities there: Kurds, Sunnis, and Shias. And they were sort of lumped together by the English, and these people just don't want to live together. That's it. That's the whole thing you need to know about the country. In a nutshell, less than 10 seconds. We don't need to get into any more discussion. But I would put it to you that the way to understand why Iraq is in the shape that it is today, and to reflect a bit more on the past 10 years, it requires much more than this. There are four very important points that I think we should keep in mind when considering why Iraq is in such a state of social fragmentation, of it seems almost impossible to create a political consensus, of general chaos. The first is almost 40 years of a fascistic rule by the Ba'ath Party, and then especially the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein. This is, in the media in the West, this is often portrayed as Saddam, the evil person who's a half-mad individual, and that's why, he's such a terrible dictator. But there are much more important structural issues here. All over the third world countries, you see very authoritarian regimes rising, and then especially Iraq. I remember, for example, as a teenager growing up in the 70s, we were so proud of our country progressing so rapidly, with the incredible wealth that we had, with the explosion of a middle class, quite a skilled labor force. And we couldn't wait to catch up with the West. There was no time to waste. We needed firm authority to mobilize all the powers of the state. This lent itself to an authoritarian rule, totalitarianism, ultimately the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein. And I can discuss this more if you like. I'm only going to mention these points rather rapidly. But the thing about dictatorship and a fascistic rule is that it breeds a culture of fear like you cannot imagine. fear of a father from his son, fear from a brother to his brother. You're always wondering if anybody's listening. There were laws that were passed in Iraq that were so draconian that it made me laugh, for example, when I lived in Egypt, when people compared Mubarak and Saddam Hussein. I said, oh, if only we could have Mubarak. We'd be very happy. You can't compare. I mean, the extent of state repression is very difficult, really, to get across. Just a quick example. If I wanted to get together with my friends, this was in the late 70s, early 80s, just to have a get-together of more than 3 people technically, but the government would let you get away with about 5 or 6. You need the approval of the local party boss for that. And on and on and on. I mean, the laws for execution was anything. I mean, if you breathe the wrong way, you might be executed. And the other amazing thing about it is that not only were you culpable if you broke the law, but your relatives up to 3rd degree of relation were responsible and could be punished, and they were. So this bred a terrible culture of fear and cronyism as well. I mean, the only way to get up, to move ahead in the world is to buddy up to some party official. So this was an important issue. The second is that Iraq suffered 3 terrible wars, especially the 8-year war with Iran. I'm amazed at how few studies there are. I mean, you will find some studies on the strategic movement of soldiers, etc. But the social, and especially the social implication of 8 years, one of the most grueling, one of the most savage wars of the 20th century. 1 million casualties in a country that is rather small. Again, you know, to give you the full impression of what it is to be a soldier, an Iraqi soldier, for 8 years, it's very difficult to do in 10 minutes. But just as a quick example of this, the Battle of Khurram Shahr in 1982 was the 2nd largest battle in history, after the Battle of Stalingrad. There, I know, you know, some people who participated in this, the soldiers ran out of ammunition, and they had to go at each other with their bare hands. And it was one house after another. So the soldiers came back from this, and you can imagine, Baghdad, of course, is full of men who have lost limbs. But more than that, there was an incredible culture of violence now that has come out of this. It's not just because people shot guns and killed, but because they came back to find their wives had already married, you know, children being fathered out of that had never met their fathers. A very deep wound was placed on Iraqis and Iranians, of course. This, in addition to the incredible physical destruction of the American aerial bombardment, which devastated the infrastructure in a country that depended very heavily on industries. These first 2 points are completely indigenous. They're our own making. The next 2, I'm afraid, there was a little help from outside in the sad state that Iraq is in. The third point is the 13 years of sanctions that Iraq faced. Now, this is the single most complete blockade of any country in history. It completely destroyed the Iraqi middle class. It transformed once very proud salaried officials into beggars, into the streets, literally. And this created a culture of poverty and crime. Incredible crime syndicates were suddenly formed, mafias that people had never heard of. Everybody sort of said Saddam Hussein was oppressive, but at least, you know, there was law and order. Well, law and order began to break down during the sanctions period. And Saddam Hussein didn't mind that, actually. He sort of retrenched into his own palaces and let the country fall to pieces. The fourth point is, of course, the American occupation in 2003. Now, I don't know enough really about American foreign policy, and I'm going to be very much a student to hear Mr. Hill's, I'm sure, very interesting comments about all of this. But when you conquer a country that is so devastated and bearing such incredible wounds, social wounds that are very deep, it is, you compound the problem if you completely do away with the state and its apparatus, including, of course, the army, the police, the administrative sector, through the de-Baathification. I mean, I've lived all my life to see the end of the Ba'ath Party, but not like this, not by simply dismissing all of the administrators because of their suspected affiliation with the Ba'ath Party. Everybody had to belong to the Ba'ath Party in order to hold any kind of meaningful administrative post. So, within a very short period, here you have a country that is so deeply traumatized, and suddenly there's no police, there's no army, and the looting and so forth followed. I was in Syria when my wife and I were watching, the statue of Saddam falling. We started dancing around the room saying we're going to go back to Baghdad and reclaim our property and so forth. And then the looting happens, and I still remember very distinctly an American soldier who was there, and I don't blame Americans. I mean, I adore the United States, by the way, and many things about it. But I remember one American soldier who basically was commenting to one of the networks, I believe it was CNN, and he said, well, they're looting, what can we do? We gave them democracy and they don't know what to do with it. Now, I was a student in Washington, D.C., when a certain person by the name of Rodney King was beaten by American police. And suddenly, all of the American cities were up in flames, and there was looting and so forth all over the place. Certainly, I'm not comparing the two. But if you take a country that is so deeply traumatized, on its knees, barely starving as a result of the sanctions, and then you take away the police and army, and you don't have anywhere near the number of troops that are required to police it yourself, of course there's going to be looting, and it's going to be organized looting. The criminal gangs that had developed in the sanctions period began to organize this looting. It became well-organized looting, and thus it became very difficult to stop. So these are the 4 points that one must bear in mind when trying to figure out what's going on in Iraq today. It's not just a question of Kurd, Shia, Sunni. Iraq in the past 10 years has witnessed an incredible social transformation. The middle class is gone, and there's a new middle class that is developing. A middle class that has gained most of its wealth through looting, and thus has a criminal mentality, which makes it very difficult to organize sort of nice entrepreneurial development. The divisions that Iraq is facing have been accentuated by foreign involvement. Today, U.S. involvement is receding, but that of Iran and Turkey is increasing. There is huge corruption, which is the biggest problem now, and thus loss of public funds. The current Iraqi government has just passed a budget which is the largest budget in the history of the country, and yet the infrastructure, electricity, clean water and so forth still are rather rare in the country. Nevertheless, there are some really impressive gains that have been made. The press in Iraq is remarkable, really. It's one of the freest in the Arab world. And it is actually not just free, but of high quality. The NGOs that have sprung up, a people, with no training in any kind of non-governmental work, suddenly from creating from its own will a series of wonderful NGOs that have done very good work all throughout the country. Several elections have been held, and while there's corruption and all kinds of questions, they have been held. And I do believe that they actually represent the general will of the country. To me, when I look at the past 10 years, and I hope that we'll have a chance of a discussion, the most significant thing is not that the country is fractured, that sectarianism is rampant. One would expect this of any country that has gone through these kind of traumas. I would even wager if the United States went through traumas like this, you would see a rise in racism, for example, or some other hidden social tensions. What to me is the most remarkable is that Iraq is still hanging on to its unity with difficulty, but it's still hanging on stubbornly, despite being pulled at the seams. The other really interesting thing is that the forces that are most active in stabilizing the country, in emphasizing its unity, in combating sectarianism, are not the classical secular parties and individuals. They actually come from religious and tribal backgrounds. Thus, for example, we hear of Sheikh Abdul Malik al-Sa'di, a renowned Sunni scholar, quite strict, really, in his observation, and rather backward in some of the ways that he views society. Nevertheless, he is in the forefront of condemning any kind of sectarianism, calling on Sunni Shi'i rapprochement. On the other side, you see Ayatollah Sistani, who has repeatedly condemned any kind of regionalism and condemned the supposedly Shi'i government in Iraq today for its corruption and so forth. And also even that strange character, Muqtada Sadr, who's very hard to predict. He has just actually gone to Samarra, where he prayed behind, and this is symbolically very important, he prayed behind a Sunni imam to show that he was willing to work with Sunnis. The same can be said of Kurdish-Arab relations. It is the tribal leaders that are in the forefront of calling for conferences, using tribal customs to try and cement unity, to emphasize that sectarianism would destroy all. Much of this is done because of opportunism, but because the sword that is hanging over one group would certainly burn everybody if it falls. But nevertheless, it is these groups that are in the forefront. And this was something that was quite surprising for me. So these are my couple of comments that I've made, and I really am very interested to hear your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Abdullah. Now we'll hear from Ambassador Christopher Hill.
Thank you very much, and let me put in a plug for this afternoon's panel, where we have George Casey, who was not only the Chief of Staff of the Army, but he was the Commanding General in Iraq during some very crucial times back in 05, 06. Let me also put in a plug for the Northcom Commander, General Chuck Jacoby, who's not only been the Northcom commander, but when I was in Iraq, that is in 09, 2010, he was the force commander, that is right under the commanding general, who at the time was General Odierno. Chuck Jacoby was in charge of all the troops, all the U.S. troops, which in 09 numbered some 145,000 troops. So these two generals alone, these two now four-star generals, I think can really give a very broad and yet very detailed picture of Iraq, the Iraq that they saw, and that the Iraq that they think it will become. There are other people on the panel. The Adjutant General of the U.S. Army. I think it will be a really extremely interesting discussion. But getting back to what Professor Abdullah and I are supposed to be doing here, I think talking maybe more about the political situation that we found Iraq in, and then on our departure we left Iraq in. I think it is very clear that the destruction of Iraq's institutions, the destruction of its economy, the destruction of its of its external relationships wasn't something that started in 2003. I would say I would completely agree with Professor Abdullah on the issue of what Saddam's legacy was in that country. Saddam Hussein, in addition to being really a murderer in a sort of first echelon level, I mean, there's a lot of competition for that in the 20th century, but he's really up there. And so in addition to the sheer murder and mayhem that his Ba'athist regime essentially created there, he also was a destroyer of Iraq's institutions, of Iraq's polity, really. It's the relationships among Kurds and among Arabs and between them. So Saddam was really weakening that country in kind of profound ways, because when you look at Iraq, when you go back 1,000 years in Iraqi history, I mean, it's a fairly strong entity. It's true it was taken over during the Ottoman Empire, as was just about every other country in the Middle East. But it had its own culture. It had an urbanized feel to it. Organized agriculture as well. It had an industry. It had a lot of things that Saddam, for a lot of reasons, destroyed. And yet, I think when we came in 2003, we did it with the idea, not very well worked out, and perhaps an idea that really reflected our own lack of consensus about what we wanted to do there. We came in with as light a force as possible. A force whose purpose was to move quickly up to Baghdad, decapitate the regime, and somehow immediately get out. Now, a lot of people in the U.S. government did not have that ambition for Iraq. They thought we should stay. They thought we should work with Iraq, turn it into that sort of shining city on the hill that would inspire the rest of the Middle East to move toward democracy, move toward even a pro-Israeli perspective. By the way, I was in Iraq for some 18 months. I never heard the word Israel the entire time I was there. I mean, Iraq is about as removed from the Palestinian Israeli issue as anyone can be. So Iraq, in short, it was we came in there with the idea that we could Rumsfeld came in there with the idea that we could decapitate the leadership and get out. Other people had much more ambitious plans for Iraq. Those people with the ambitious plans turned out to be right out of a sense of necessity. That is, we realized very quickly on we couldn't just decapitate the leadership and leave. We realized that as that military exercise came to an end, that we had a situation that was in full-blown chaos. So we began rather incrementally and rather not a very organized way to try to start building institutions. We weren't expecting to be doing that, and we didn't really know what we were doing. We borrowed techniques that we had used in the Balkans. We brought in people from the Treasury Department who would help with the Iraqi Ministry of Finance, for example. We brought in some military trainers who would help with creating a new Iraqi military. We brought in police trainers to deal with a new Iraqi police force. These are processes that take a long time. And so in those processes, we undid whatever there was there before. And I think as we essentially finished off the accoutrements of the Iraqi state, and I want to emphasize that Saddam did the lion's share of that, but as we finished off those accoutrements, we unwittingly did something else to Iraq. That is, when a state stops to function, people revert to something else. And what they reverted to in Iraq was something called sectarianism. This does not mean that we invented the Sunni-Shia divide. Sunni-Shia politics have been very complex in Iraq for centuries. But we did excite the problem. We did make the problem worse as people kind of reverted to various tribal and sectarian affiliations in a way to try to get some order out of the system. I would say the decision to engage in the de-Baathification was for many Sunnis and Shia in Iraq not so much de-Baathification. After all, the system was basically gone by the time we got there. It was seen as some kind of de-Sunnification. Many Iraqis saw what we're doing as somehow punishing the Sunnis, which was the farthest thing from our minds, but that is unfortunately how it came across. And I think that is part of the reason we ended up with a Sunni insurrection. These problems are not immutable problems. They're not problems that will never be fixed. Sunnis and Shia have lived together before. For me, it was a little reminiscent of people who would look at the Balkans and say, you know, these people have been fighting for 100 years. Who are we to tell them to get along? It's a far more complex picture than, quote, people have been fighting for hundreds of years. And if you look in Baghdad, if you look at how Shia and Sunnis have interacted without really problems, it can be put back together. But it was going to be difficult, and it was certainly going to outlast the length of time that the United States was going to be there. I would say to those who believe that somehow we have left a country that is somehow pro-Iranian or is a country that will now kind of slip into some sort of Iranian orbit, I would say that Iraqis retain a very strong sense of being Iraqis. And I would say that sense is even stronger than the sense of being Shia or Sunni. I'm speaking in the Arab areas now. And so when you look at that terrible war that Professor Abdullah described, one thing that was very interesting about that terrible war fought against Iran was that some 80% of the people who fought on the Iraqi side against Iran were in fact Shia. And there were very few examples of army mutinies. There were very few examples of any type of sort of Shia uprising within the Iraqi army during that 8-year period. So for those who think that Shia are not first Iraqis, they should think again. Similarly, I think the rest, while as this Shia-Sunni divide has been has widened during recent years, I think we also need to understand that this kind of sectarianism is not the exclusive purview of Iraq. It is happening in many other countries in the Middle East for reasons that I don't think necessarily can be explained by economics or even history. Sometimes it just is a phenomena that is in the air and is happening. It might be religious, it might be a lot of different things. So, but the upshot is that for many countries in the rest of the Arab world, an Arab world that is essentially Sunni run, there are deep suspicions about what could it mean that there is an Iraqi that is an Iraq that could be Shia dominated, rather than the sort of mosaic that Iraq has been in the past. And so I think in addition to all the internal challenges that Iraq has had, the problems of trying to stitch the country together, the problem of trying to build institutions, building its military, building its police, building its Ministry of Finance, etc. In addition to all those problems, I think as the U.S. has now has pulled out, Iraq faces a kind of difficult neighborhood. They face an Iran that is very much feeling that they are losing, not just in Iraq but in the rest of the world, and they are becoming increasingly aggressive. When you look at some of the nastiest Shia militia groups in Iraq, you can trace some of their funding to Iran. So Iran is no friend to Iraq, and certainly no friend to the Iraqi government. At the same time, many of the Sunni countries have also taken a kind of hostile view of Iraq. We were told many, many times that the Saudis are offended by Prime Minister Maliki, and that the Saudi king is offended by him, and that is why Maliki is the only is the only person or the only senior Iraqi official who's not been invited to Saudi Arabia. And so you have to ask yourself the question, well, what did Maliki do that was so offensive? The Saudis have never explained that. Instead, they've simply said Maliki has to go. And the consequence of this has been to kind of try to undermine Maliki and in a way that I think is very counterproductive to the rest of the Sunni Arab world that should really want to welcome Iraq and make sure that Iraq can be a successful country. So I think Iraq has had difficulties dealing with Iran, difficulty dealing with the Sunni Arab world, and I think for whether Iraq is successful in the future will depend to some extent on whether those countries, in the case of Iran, leave it alone. In the case of the Sunni Arab countries, kind of reach out and try to help the Iraqis get through this period. To be sure, there are, as Dr. Abdullah said, a lot of positive elements of what is going on in Iraq. We never went in there for the oil, but it is gratifying to see that Iraq was able to have a successful bidding process in the oil. They were able to get blue chip companies to go in there, and whatever Americans think about a company like British Petroleum, if they have problems with British Petroleum, they ought to look to see what Saddam's oil companies did to the environment in Iraq, where pools of oil would just be sitting out there in the desert, never evaporating and always being there and to poison the ground. So I think getting international oil companies in there for the first time in many, many decades. It was so interesting to go to Baghdad University and speak to students there. All they wanted to know was not, why did we come or why did we leave? They wanted to know how they can get a job. They wanted to know what kind of skills they need to succeed. They wanted to know, what type of American, what are American companies looking for in Iraqi students. And going down to near Basra and seeing an American company called Weatherford that was helping one of the oil companies drill and talking to some of these Iraqi engineers who had just been hired months before and seeing them in their brand new orange overalls and very much working for an American company and being very proud of that fact. And when I asked them, I told them at one point, or one of the engineers, I said, I'm going to Baghdad University, what should I tell the students there? And he said, tell them to study their math, tell them especially to study their English, and don't worry about the oil business, we'll teach them how to do that. So you really got a sense that the country is or can head in the right direction. But I think for Americans, to some extent, we need to let go of some of the negativity about Iraq. We need to learn the lesson that if you're going to go in a country like that, you better plan on staying. And I don't think Americans have the attention span for it. I don't think Americans want to see another one of these, and nor do I. But I think we need to kind of let go of some of the negativity that surrounds this country. I hear so often the criticisms of the Prime Minister, Maliki. Prime Minister Maliki, I can tell you, I can even tell YouTube, is no fun to deal with. I always say if Maliki ever had charisma, it cleared up a long time ago, but he's a very difficult guy, but I'm telling you, he has to deal with a very difficult situation. And I do not know what kind of person, what kind of dean at the Korbel school I would be if I had to deal with the problems that Maliki has to deal with every day. To be sure, the Shia power structure needs to do a better job of bringing in the Sunnis into the governmental structures. There's no question Maliki needs to do a much better job of that. But there's also, I think, no question that the Sunnis need to understand that the Shia are just not going to be out there as goat herders or imams or people who somehow are left out of governmental structures. The Shia are going to be real players, and for the time being, they're going to be players in a kind of sectarian political identity. But even that too, I think, can change over the coming years. So maybe we can go to a more interactive process at that point.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Hill.
Yeah.
What a rich set of comments from our two speakers. Lots of food for thought. I'm going to ask one follow-up question, and then we'll open it up to general discussion. Professor Abdullah, you wrote this wonderful short book, Dictatorship, Imperialism, and Chaos, Iraq since 1989. It was published in 2006, and it opens with the following words that really struck me. The American invasion of Iraq in 2003 stirred up a host of contradictory feelings in many Iraqis. My wife and I, who were nervously watching the events from Syria, worried about American intentions and the eruption of uncontrollable forces. At the same time, we rejoiced at the toppling of a brutal regime which had caused both our families terrible suffering. 3 years on, we are still struggling with these emotions. That really struck me, and that was written just 3 years after the invasion of Iraq. We're now 10 years since the invasion, and I'm wondering how you and your wife feel, but also the emotions that you say that many, many Iraqis felt about these contradictory emotions about the U.S. invasion and the toppling of Saddam's regime now a decade on. And maybe I'll just add to that you said something last night that struck me as well. You said that, when you observe the debates going on in Iraq today with this flourishing media that you mentioned earlier, one of the striking things about it is that the question of the United States is really quite remote from the discussion in Iraq today. And I found that really interesting. If you could elaborate on that a little bit and talk a little bit about what is the debate in Iraq today? What are the issues and the contentions that animate Iraqis at this moment?
Okay. There's quite a bit, actually, in that question of yours. I don't know if I'll be able to answer everything, but I'll give it a shot. The contradictory feelings that I have, and I'm glad I can do it because I'm not in a position of authority and I don't have to make a firm decision, as I said in my opening remarks. I believe the majority of Iraqis had them. I mean, going back to Iraq soon after the fall of the dictatorship and hanging around in the cafes and so forth, everybody was expressing practically the exact same feelings that I was. We didn't know what to make of it. Should we rejoice or should we be extremely concerned about what the Americans were up to? No disrespect, Mr. Ambassador. But America did not enter Iraq without some really heavy baggage. I mean, the United States, prior to World War II, was very welcome in the Middle East. But after World War II, and as a result of the Cold War competition, there were some very nasty things that the United States had to do. And, I don't blame it. It was a life and death struggle with the Soviet Union. But, for example, the American policy in installing the Shah. We now know that the 1963 coup in Iraq, which first brought the Ba'ath Party to power, was supported in one way or another from the Americans. I spoke to one of the undersecretaries in the American embassy who was there in 1963, and he told me that it was the general opinion of the American embassy and the American foreign, the State Department, that the Ba'ath Party were an excellent choice to rule Iraq. They spoke about socialism, which might be good, and they were not against free enterprise. But most importantly, they were hardcore anti-communists. I mean, that is the single most important principle of the Ba'ath Party. When one looks at the booklet, defining the Ba'ath, written by Michel Aflaq of Syria, the intellectual founder of the Ba'ath Party, the first point is to combat communism. Second point is Arab unity. Then he talks about everything else. And of course, this was a major concern for the Americans. But to be involved in these kind of struggles in the Arab world, and then especially, of course, the relationship, the evolving relationship between the United States and Israel, the whole Palestine catastrophe and so forth, meant that when the United States entered Iraq in 2003, people were not sure about, what are they going to do here? Are they going to conspire to divide the country up? This was a very often cited thing, that the Americans are coming in, they're going to divide up the country, to enable them to rule it easier, etc. This is exactly what the English and the French did after World War I, and the whole thing is repeating itself. So the United States came in already, with a tainted image in the Arab world, which didn't make the task of the American administrators any easier, for sure. But I still, to this day, am not really resolved as to what I think of. I mean, if you were to ask me now, okay, was it worth it? Should the Americans have gone in? I'd probably say no. The United States should not have gone in now, knowing what happened afterward and so forth. But I don't say that with a strong conviction too, because I'm not so certain that Saddam's dictatorship would have been overthrown either, and that was devastating the country even more. So I struggle with this issue, and I tell you, very, very honestly, that I'm not sure about my feelings in that regard. Concerning the debates in the Iraqi media, one of the things that is rather surprising to an extent is that there isn't that much of a discussion of 10 years after, let us reassess this. You find one or two op-ed pieces, very minor in fact, by none of them by the major contributors to the newspapers. Most of the major editorials are focused squarely on the issue of how to invigorate the political institutions, how to combat sectarianism and to bolster a national feeling, questions about how to resolve the oil disputes with the Kurdish region, and to convince the Kurds that it is in their interest to remain in the Union. There's no question about Shi'is and Sunnis separating. That is really overblown. But the Kurdish region in the north really does have a distinct, national identity. And I, for example, myself as an Arab, I truly I would respect the decision of the Kurds to do what they want to do in their region. But I would try to convince them very strongly that it would be in their long-term interest to remain in Iraq rather than to go it alone. The Kurds are not as unified as one might think. Their worst bloodshed occurred in the mid-90s when they went to war against each other. And there were many more Kurds killed by brother Kurds than by Saddam Hussein even. And there's even a religious divide in Kurdistan. This is not often understood. Yes, the Kurds are almost all Sunni Muslim, but of two variant types of mystical orders. In the east, in Sulaymaniya, the Naqshbandiya order is much more prominent, whereas in the west, around Erbil, it is the Qadiriya order. The dialect is very distinct also. So there are all kinds of issues there that and these are the things that are debated in the press. When reference is made to the Americans, to be quite honest, it is mixed. Some editorials talk about some of the good things the Americans have done, some of the genuine attempts they've made, and others are quite I think rightly critical of many of the things that the Americans did while there. But it doesn't take up a large space in the newspaper. Most of the discussion is not really about America. It's slowly becoming more and more irrelevant, actually.
I mean, it's not all about us.
No.
Very hard for a lot of Americans to process that, I think.
I
I think it's important to hear that. Ambassador Hill?
When I was there at the end of June 2009, a decision that was implemented, which was for the American troops to pull out of the cities, towns, and populated areas. And I remember this was this essentially reduced our forces to be sort of out of the desert in encampments with some patrolling, but not a lot, because at the same time we were turning over a lot of the checkpoints, principally in the green zone, turning them over to Iraq. And I remember Prime Minister Maliki spoke in a way that was kind of upsetting to a lot of Americans, because he said in a speech, he said, "This is a great moment for Iraqis. This is a great victory for us, that the Americans are now out of our cities, out of our towns. It's a great victory. But with all great victories will come some casualties. It will be difficult, but we need to manage this suffering that might happen, and manage it with the understanding that we are taking our country back." Well, it came as kind of to Americans listening to this speech delivered to Iraqis. It was a little strange that he talked about a great victory. I mean, what's the victory? I mean, we wanted to get out of the towns. Yet, what he was really doing was telling people that the Iraqi army was probably not really ready for the task, and in the process, they would be attacked by various groups, that there would be casualties, there would be suffering. So he was basically trying to prepare the Iraqi people for what would be a difficult phase, and the best way to do that was to appeal to their sense of nationalism. So that is the kind of discussion that went on, such that I think by the time 2010 came around, it was pretty clear that people were ready to see the Americans leave. They understood that we cannot solve their political problems for them. Those who felt that we would at least solve all their economic problems for them by paving the streets with gold realized that that wasn't going to happen either. So I think while we talked a lot about these last troops leaving Iraq, back in Iraq, that was not what was on people's minds.
Interesting. I think this would be a good juncture to open the discussion up. I'll just quickly announce that the Center for Middle East Studies is hosting yet another speaker on Iraq on April 15th. Fuad Hussein, the Chief of Staff to the Kurdish Regional President in Iraq, Masoud Barzani. You can get the details for that event on our website, du.edu/Korbel/Middle East. You can also check it out on our Facebook page or sign up for our events email newsletter, and you'll get the details about that. Who would like to pose a question? Yes, and please briefly introduce yourself and tell us if your question is directed for Professor Abdullah or Ambassador Hill or both. Yes, Professor Khan.
Thank you. Thank you both for such an enlightening set of two talks. I learned a lot, and I thought, by the way, I'm Professor Thabit Khan. I also work at the Korbel School of International Studies, and very pleased to have Ambassador Hill as our current dean. I very much applaud the sentiment and idea that Americans should be fascinated about Iraq. And as an American citizen and world citizen, I certainly am trying to do my share. And as part of that, I want to tell you, this might be a bit heartening, but not too heartening, that in recent high-level meetings at Asian Development Bank and in Japan, there have been talks of helping Iraq more. These are still talks, and more education is needed there. If you think Americans need to be educated, you haven't heard those people, well, I have. But my question is the following. The situation is very complicated, and it is, all the relations are complicated. One only has to reflect about what happened to Imam Hussein and his entourage in 680 AD in Karbala, and how to remember that in Iraq to realize this. But both of you mentioned about Iraq, Iran, and Turkey gaining some influence, although from various angles. and I just mentioned Asia. I do think that there are actually ways of looking at these relationships, especially economically, but also politically, that can be beneficial to all the parties, and not just because of energy. You know, there are lots of other issues, regional issues, as well as issues that affect Asia as a whole, Japan, China especially, but also Russia. I just want to hear your take on this. What would be the best way to proceed towards economic and other forms of cooperation between Iraq and some of these other countries?
So just to repeat the question briefly, in summary, what would be the best way, given this new constellation in the neighborhood, what would be the best way for Iraq to interact and engage with its neighbors on the economic and geostrategic fronts? Professor Abdullah or Ambassador Hill, either of you.
I'll say something briefly about this. I've always held the opinion that the chief responsibility for what has happened to Iraq and what will happen internally and in terms of foreign relations is primarily our responsibility. It's the responsibility of Iraqis. And the most important ingredient for better economic relations with the neighbors of Iraq is internal stability, for sure. And that will take still many years. I mean, all kinds of deals can be worked out and so on, but the wounds that I spoke of, that go back decades, are impossible. It is impossible to resolve them rapidly. No deal, no brokering, no mediation can erase those memories. Another very important aspect here is to try and calm the region down also. As Iran, I fully agree with Ambassador Hill's comment that as Iran now feels threatened, this will reflect more negatively on relations in Iraq, because Iran does have an influence on Iraq. Not nearly as much as people think, but it does have an influence. There are even some new militia groups that have been created with even stronger links to Iran than previously, and they can be used to stir up trouble if it is felt that this would somehow ease the tensions on Iran. But the most destructive thing in the Middle East now that has affected Iraq is the civil war in Syria. I mean, that has for a while there, the political conditions in Iraq were becoming steadily more stable. There was more communication. There was much less sectarianism. One can see this, for example, when one compares the first election with the second election. The first election that occurred rather not too long after the invasion, the groups organized themselves on almost purely sectarian lines. In the second election that took place, these sectarian lines were beginning now to break apart. So, Alawi's group, for example, includes Shias and Sunnis and so forth, and Maliki was able to win over many Sunni elements also within his coalition. The Shia bloc broke apart into bickering groups. The civil war in Syria is beginning to reignite sectarianism once again. So the key to this is first internal stability in Iraq, that is primarily our responsibility, and secondly, anything that can be done to calm the neighbors down would be much appreciated.
Yeah.
Ambassador Hill, did you want to add anything to that?
I completely agree with that. I think the U.S., though, should probably do more to try to calm the neighbors down, especially in some of the countries like Saudi Arabia, where we have some big influence. I mean, Saudis are not helping the situation in Iraq when they claim that Maliki is some kind of Iranian agent and this sort of thing. This is very unhelpful, and I think, unfortunately, it's also, I think Syria is a very key element of all this. You see the Sunni Arab states all supporting the Syrian opposition, as we've been supporting the Syrian opposition, albeit for different reasons. And I think it has just spilled into the issue of Iraq, which is perceived as somehow not being supportive of the Syrian opposition. So I think Iraq is kind of getting a pounding right now, and I think a lot of this cross-border, these so-called foreign fighters are coming over into Iraq in a way that they haven't for several years now. So I think Iraq is really in the sort of midst of a high crime neighborhood, and I think they're, to the extent we have influence with some of these countries, we should be exercising it.
Sam.
A question about the geopolitical consequence of the war in Iraq. The war in Iraq exactly did the geopolitical transition of the first century, that is the rise of Western powers, particularly China. U.S. spent so much money in Iraq while the North. In fact, when before it was coming back, U.S. was going after China, talking about China was competitive. Now spend so much time and spend so much money and so much knowledge, and now China is rising. China now is doing better after so many years that China suffered a lot of oil money. Now China is back to run those money. Some people say China is winning now in the Middle East. In fact, Chinese exporters now talking about when U.S. pivot toward the Pacific, they are pivot toward the Middle East. So my questions to the two speakers are, the Professor Abdullah is, how the Middle East you see them see this transition of power, and for Ambassador Hill is, how do you draw lessons from these 10 years of U.S. war in Iraq in a big picture of the politics?
Thanks so much for that question, Sam. So just briefly, the geopolitics of the region, the rise in the context of the rise of Eastern countries, particularly China's role in the Middle East, and the question of the pivot. Professor Abdullah.
The pivot. All right. I'm not really an expert on foreign relations or anything like that, but I can tell you the mood in Iraq is one of great excitement at China's increasing involvement. Actually, I can say that this is not just Iraq, but the region as a whole. I mean, when I was living in Egypt, the Egyptians were extremely happy at any indication of greater Chinese involvement in the Middle East. China is not seen as a threat. China's rise is seen as a great opportunity for the Middle East to be able to be a bit more competitive in terms of choosing alliances and deals and so forth, and so I think the overall feeling is that when the Iraqi government signed petroleum deals with China, that this would be the beginning of a process that would increase. And I've even seen a report which speaks about Iraqi petroleum prospects, and it's extremely optimistic. It's saying that within a decade or two, Iraq is going to begin to even compete with Saudi Arabia. I mean, already today, Iraq is the third largest exporter of petroleum in the world after Saudi Arabia and Russia, and the second most important in the Middle East. And the whole country is floating on oil, and there are large swaths of the country that have not been explored yet, and there's a great deal of optimism that even more petroleum is going to be found. The view is that much of this will go to service the Chinese economy, and that this would reflect very positively on economic and political developments in Iraq.
I think among U.S. opinion leaders, there's a sense that we're overinvested in Iraq and in the Middle East, And I think this was the basic impetus for the so-called pivot, to try to reduce that relative investment in the Middle East and try to move our investment and our future to East Asia. Unfortunately, however, I think the pivot turned into more of a military pivot, or certainly that was the reputation, that somehow we're pivoting to East Asia for the purpose of confronting the Chinese. I don't think that's been particularly helpful to our relationships in East Asia. So I don't think we've gained much there, and I think to some extent we've lost in the Middle East, where I think we're perceived as if not a declining power, then at least an exiting power. And my sense is that John Kerry is trying to once again try to right the ship a little by already, I guess, having spent two trips to the Middle East. I don't think the Middle East is going to go away. I don't care how much shale, how much fracking we do in North Dakota. I think we're still going to be pretty interested in Middle East oil. I think we're going to be interested in Middle East stability. I think we're going to be interested in Israel, and we're going to be interested in trying to be helpful in the process of democratization in the region, such as it is. So I think the notion that we were going to turn away from those problems was perhaps exaggerated in the minds of those who advocated it, and certainly exaggerated by the U.S. press.
More questions from the audience? Certainly there would have to be at least one. Yes, in the back.
Thank you both for being here. My name is Annie, and I am a student at Korbel and the Associate Director for the Center on Rice Development. And I was curious to hear what both of you would have to say in regards to, I hear a permeating theme of a sense of Iraqi identity as being one of the key solutions or key notions needing to go forward and to unite the Kurds and Sunni and Shia in the region. I also hear you saying that perhaps our generation is looking towards more economic paths, and people in universities are saying, how do we get jobs? And where's the math and the sciences? So how do we combine those, or what does the future of Iraqi identity look like if you have young people both looking outward, trying to find an opportunity there, and how does that affect their sense of Iraqi identity that's needed to stabilize internal Iraqi functions and operations?
Great question. The future of Iraqi identity, given both the outward and inward-looking nature of the situation in Iraq today, with young Iraqis looking for jobs, looking outside, but also trying to build and cohere an internal Iraqi identity.
I think Iraq certainly has the prospect of having an Iraqi identity. I think it's an identity that could be that could indeed be much more secular than sectarian. I think in constructing a secular identity, though, one should not sort of go off on sort of phony isms like Baathism or communism, or these various isms that I think were often designed to get away from sectarianism and then created things that were much worse. So I think what has to be done, and I think you see this in a younger generation in Iraq, and if they can just calm down the security situation, a lot of good things can happen. But I think you'll see people more interested in economic issues than in sectarian issues. And if that process can be continued, despite the headwinds that certainly Syria and other places are causing today, I think Iraq can get back to the concept that there is a polity there that is multi-sectarian, and people managed to do that in the past and should be able to do that in the future. That should be the goal. The only trouble is, I don't care how many years of American occupation you have, it's not going to work because of us. It's going to work because the Iraqis have decided they need to make it work. So I hope that the Sunnis understand that in the context of a political identity that is today unfortunately more sectarian than not, that in that context, yes indeed, there are going to be a lot of Shia leaders in Iraq, and at the same time the Shia need to understand that they can't rule this country against the Sunnis. The Sunnis need to be a part of the structure. They get it. They do understand it. If Maliki were sitting here grimacing at you, he would also say something like, look, I want to have more Sunnis. I understand that we can't run this place without Sunnis, and certainly the Kurds need to feel not only welcome, but that it's in their interest to stay.
Professor Abdullah, did you want to add anything to that?
Briefly, in terms of a historic background to this, Iraq has always been, the land between the two rivers, Mesopotamia, has always been incredibly diverse in terms of its population. One of the reasons for that is that it was in the crossroads of migration routes, and thus various ethnic groups were constantly adding to the population, and various ideas were also coming in and gaining ground. But through it all, and this is rather remarkable, the people who inhabited the banks of the two rivers, who were very jealous about maintaining, certain distinctions, especially when it comes to marriage. You can all kinds of things are permitted. Just don't marry into my community. Nevertheless, there was, I think, from earliest days, an understanding that it is much better to find a way to cooperate and to tolerate one another than it would be to try and eliminate and create some kind of a single religion or a single ethnic group that would dominate the region. Even, I've read works, unfortunately, that are not really grounded in serious research, that nonchalantly say that under the Ottoman Empire, Iraq was divided into 3 provinces, the Kurds in the north, Sunnis in the middle, Shias in the south. True, but Baghdad was the center. The Wali of Baghdad had a predominant role to play in the whole area. And throughout the 19th century, the Ottoman administration was constantly writing reports about the need to conglomerate this whole region because it's much easier to manage, since economically and administratively it makes much more sense. So yes, it is very diverse, and yet throughout history, this area has found a way to work together. Iraq right now sends a record number of students abroad to study. Most of them are returning, actually, in the hopes of building a better future. It's still very risky business. That's why I thought I was going to go back in 2004, and when they started assassinating university professors, I didn't think it would be a good place to raise my children. But I still dream of it, and if not for me, I think it is a very, very possible future.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. I thought I saw a hand up earlier. Yeah, my bad. Yes, please. Joe.
For your comments. My name is Joe Rice. I would be interested in hearing both of your thoughts on how the U.S. should engage with Iraq right now. Diplomatically, student exchanges, NGOs, what kind of cooperation and relationship should our country have? And also, the premise of the question is it's mutual, what they want, not anything forced upon them. So how should we engage with Iraq?
Joe Rice's question about how the U.S. should engage with Iraq now, at this point in time, 2 ways, from the Iraqi and the U.S. perspective.
Well, I think we should engage with them the way we should engage with everybody, that is, with due respect for their point of view. I think we need to be a little careful with the finger wagging. That's become a sort of occupational hazard of Americans in dealing with foreigners, and I think we've got to be real careful about it in Iraq. Look, as I've suggested, Prime Minister Maliki is a very difficult person with many flaws, but I think we need to be careful about going to Baghdad and slamming him and coming away and then telling the press how much we slammed him. I don't think it goes over well with him, and frankly speaking, I don't think it goes over well with the Iraqi public. Many people in the Iraqi public can't stand their own prime minister, but I don't think we need to be the ones to pile on. I especially think we need to be careful not to be aiding and abetting the notion that he's some kind of Iranian agent, and that's kind of what we did when we allowed the issue of Iranian overflights to dominate the messaging out of the Kerry Maliki bilat a couple of weeks ago. That is definitely a subject to be brought up with him, but it's not the subject to be telling the press was somehow the main subject. So I think we need to work in a more traditional diplomatic context with them. I think we need to try to keep a robust exchange program going with them. I think the more Iraqis who come and study in the States, the more people like that, the more people like Professor Abdullah would be in very good shape in Iraq. So I think we need to keep up the exchanges work, and I hope we can encourage our companies to be active. I think it's great that they sign these contracts with the Chinese, but I think it would be really nice if we saw more American companies on the ground. So I'm a believer in the relationship, but I think we're going to have to show an extra amount of patience with that country, even more than we do in other countries.
I'm actually very happy to hear Ambassador Hill's point of view. It gives me great heart because the short reply is America should not treat Iraq the way Paul Bremer treated Iraq, if you'll permit me to go that far, where even the strongest allies of the United States. I spoke actually with Jalal Talbani once, and he told me that he couldn't stand talking to Paul Bremer because he was so disrespectful and very authoritarian in his approach. So I completely agree with what the ambassador said. One other thing I would add is that the United States still has very important political influence, and it could possibly do a bit more in terms of mediating between the different contending parties. If you'll permit me, in this whole discussion, I've tried to focus primarily on point of view of Iraq and so forth. One thing I would say about America, where I studied and lived in, and I come to love as a country and have great admiration, especially for the spirit of freedom that I really feel is very genuine here. But America is also an incredibly powerful country, maybe more powerful than Americans realize. And power can be very intoxicating. It has been the ruin of numerous empires throughout history. So when power begins to intoxicate some people who run the state, they might begin to dream that they have almost godlike capabilities of with a single command creating a country in America's own image. It doesn't work that way. People even in the poorest, weakest countries will fight tooth and nail for their own interest against, very, very powerful states, and have an enormous influence on the outcome. So try not to do this again.
We might have time for one last question. We are running up on 2 o'clock now. It's 1:57. If there's a brief question, I do see a hand. Yes.
My name is Gloria Collette. I'm an undergraduate in international relations. And my question is, what were the biggest mistakes made by the United States, and what lessons can we take away from it going into the future?
What were the biggest mistakes made by the U.S. in the occupation of Iraq, and what lessons can we draw from them for the future?
Well, all right, I'll take a whack at that with 2 minutes to go. But I think, first of all, we had no consensus as to why we were going in. Some people went in because they thought we could reconstitute Iraq in our image. Others went in because they thought it was weapons of mass destruction. Others went in, as I said earlier, with a view that somehow we just decapitate the leadership and be home by Christmas. Others felt we needed to create a new leadership. So I think first lesson is if you're going to invade a country, you better know why, and you better know what you plan to do. It's very clear that when Paul Wolfowitz infamously said in congressional testimony, contradicting at the time General Shinseki, who had said we need some 300,000 troops for the occupation of Iraq, he said in one of the greatest non sequiturs I've ever heard a senior official say, he said, "Why do you think we would need 3 times as many troops to occupy it as we would to invade it?" Well, that has nothing to do with it. The two things have nothing to do with each other. I mean, so, it'd be like saying, why do we need 300,000 to occupy Iraq when you only need 11 people on a football team? I just it has nothing to do with anything. So that was the kind of, frankly speaking, facile thinking that went into some of this. So we got to be real careful about that in the future. And then as for the rest of the answer, I think you've heard us for the last hour or so, and I think you've gleaned a lot of it. But not being arrogant is a pretty good way to run your life and run your foreign policy. Being respectful of way other people do things, even though they're not the way you would want to do them. And also, when you see a dictator, the first question should not be how do you get rid of them. The first question is how do you get there in the first place. And that first question can inform the second question. So I think we didn't know enough about Iraq or why Saddam Hussein was there. We just thought he had come from Mars or something. And, there are a lot of, there's no more complex country in the Middle East than Iraq. So we took on the most complex country with some of the most simple-minded thinking. So.
Professor Abdullah?
I don't have anything to add.
I want to thank our two speakers. I think this was actually just a fantastic conversation, a really interesting juxtaposition and balance of views and perspectives, a very rich discussion about a very important issue. And I want to remind everyone that right here in this room at 5:30 today, Part 2 of today's conference on the lessons from the Iraq War 10 years on will be taking place with General George Casey, General Chuck Jacoby, and several others. Please be here for that conversation at 5:30. And again, I should suggest as well that Professor Abdullah's books are here for sale, and I highly recommend them so that you can enjoy more of his insights into Iraqi history and politics. And again, if you'd like to get on our mailing list for the Center for Middle East Studies and our forthcoming events, you can sign up in the back or just follow us on Facebook, check out our website. Thank you very much on behalf of the Center for Middle East Studies for being here this afternoon.